The story of the wooden wildfowl decoy begins in the early 1800s, when American hunters first began to craft them. However, decoy carving really took off after the Civil War, as waterfowl hunting became increasingly popular.
Well, the first matter is the fact that we are on the great flyway, the Mississippi Flyway, where the wildfowl fly from Canada to southern states and back again in the spring. This contributed to the massive number of waterfowl flocks that came up the Illinois River Valley. That was the primary reason for the popularity of hunting. Of course, it was a sport as well as a means of providing meat for the markets in Chicago and St. Louis. So the combination of the commercial value and the sporting value is what contributed to the popularity of hunting.
Well, fortunately, my uncle lived on a farm on the Illinois River just edge of Henry, where I live now. And I was visiting him one day, and he said, "Why don't you go out and shoot some geese?" Okay, so I thought that over, and I didn't own a gun at the time, but I borrowed a shotgun from a friend of mine, and I went out to my uncle's cornfield and shot an old blue goose, which is not a choice eating bird whatsoever, but anyhow I was all pumped up, and I walked in and said, "Here's my first bird." So I was hooked from then on. That was 1945. So I started getting real interested in hunting, and my uncle had a backwater pond on his farm also, so he said, "Why don't you go down there hunting?" So I said, "Okay." First thing I knew, I had to have some decoys, so I started gathering duck decoys, wooden ones at the time, because there were no plastic or paper mache decoys on the market.
Unfortunately, just as the need for decoys was increasing, land development and urban expansion were beginning to take a toll on Illinois wildlife. As Illinois wetlands were drained and developed for human usage, not only did waterfowl lose their habitats, but new railways and highways brought more hunters to the remaining areas. Also, the growth of Midwestern cities such as Chicago increased demand for wild game, which gave rise to the market hunters, professionals who shot vast quantities of wildfowl and sold them in urban markets. Around the turn of the century, the state and federal governments took action to try to protect wildfowl populations. In 1900, the U.S. government passed the Lacey Act, giving the Biological Survey of the U.S. Department of Agriculture the task of leading conservation efforts. A few years later, the state of Illinois first imposed limits on the number of birds hunters could shoot. Then, with the Migratory Bird Act of 1918, the federal government assumed full responsibility for protecting the nation's waterfowl. In 1935, it banned two luring tactics, using trained birds as live decoys and baiting birds with feed.
One time, about 1955, I remember going up to Hennepin. It was called the drainage district at that time. It was impounded several little potholes that were impounded, and the farmers drained it, and they planted corn. And I remember it was Thanksgiving Day, 1955, I would say. My girlfriend at the time wanted to see some ducks, so I knew darn well where they were. We went up there, and they were just spiraling in this field. You couldn't believe it. There were thousands of them. You know, how can you estimate the amount of ducks that you see? But the sky was black with them, and and since then I have been hooked on duck hunting and pushing, and I think it's about my last year, but I'm getting too old for that now. But I've had a real enjoyable time, met a lot of nice people, and got interested in collecting decoys, and got hooked up with Merle Glick from Pekin, and we came up with the idea to have duck decoy collection, and he mentioned Lakeview Museum, and therefore here we are today.
Since the shooting of wildfowl was just unlimited, it depleted the size of the flocks. The numbers went way down, and of course that affected the availability of hunting. Market hunters could no longer shoot birds by the trainload to the meat markets, and so it soon dwindled to a sport where people who could afford to have good guns and had access to hunting places would shoot on weekends and at other times. It became a sport rather than a necessity.
Many hunters held on to their wood decoys, and now, thanks to them and to decoy collectors, these handcrafted tools for hunting are recognized as a genuine form of American folk art. One of the qualities of folk art objects is that they are not made by someone considered to be a professional artist. That is, one who makes art for a living. They are usually utilitarian, and they represent a balance of craftsmanship and functionality. These three qualities can all be found in wooden waterfowl decoys. Hunters themselves often carved their own decoys, sometimes aided by friends or family. There were also commercial carvers who made decoys for a living rather than solely as an outgrowth of their hunting, and companies that mass-produced wooden decoys. Both filled the needs of those hunters who didn't make their own. For crafting decoys, wood was a natural choice as a material that floats in water. Most decoys consisted of three parts: the upper and lower halves of the body, and a separate piece forming the head and the neck. Usually the body was hollowed out, which produced birds that were lighter and floated higher in the water, making them more visible. The sections were glued and or nailed together, and a lead keel weight, sometimes bearing the maker's name, was mounted on the bottom for stability. Once the decoy was fully carved, it could be painted, first with a base coat to seal the wood, and then with the feather pattern of the desired species of fowl. Sometimes a wife or friend of the decoy carver did the painting. In any case, the style of painting may reflect what the painter thought to be more sensible: a simplified, easy-to-paint pattern, or a more detailed and presumably more illusionistic pattern. Some decoys were made to depict sleeping or feeding birds, providing variety and perhaps a sense of security for the real birds. Combining utility and creativity, decoys are both art and artifact. Because of the historical and aesthetic value of the waterfowl decoy, LakeView Museum has accumulated the finest collection of Illinois River decoys of any American museum.
Well, there are many museums that have a few decoys, but in the realm of Illinois decoys, the Illinois State Museum has a nice collection, and the Milwaukee Public Museum likewise, but they're usually not on display, or perhaps only just a few. In the eastern states, the Ward Museum, the Ward Museum of Wildlife Art, and the Havre de Grace Museum both have vast collections of decoys, but not too many are of Illinois origin. There's many more Eastern carvers and, of course, collectors to fill these museums. So Lakeview Museum has the premier collection of anyone in the state, the country, or the world as far as Illinois River decoys are concerned.
5 carvers in particular make Lakeview Museum's collection noteworthy. First among them is Robert Elliston of Bureau. Active from the late 1800s until his death in 1915, Elliston is thought to be the first Illinois professional decoy maker. His wife, Catherine, helped him by skillfully painting his carvings. Another great husband and wife team was the Perdues, Charles and Edna. For 4 decades, Edna painted the decoys carved by Charlie until the early 1940s, when illness forced her to stop. Still, the multi-talented Charlie continued to make decoys, painting them himself well into his 80s. Over the years, he also operated his own gun shop and made duck calls, and crow decoys. Perhaps for these reasons, and because of the standards of his carving and Edna's painting, Purdue is now the most famous of all Illinois decoy carvers. Less prolific, but no less skilled at decoy production, was Charles Walker of Princeton. He was active from the mid-1920s to about 1950, and his skill at painting naturalistic birds was well known. The final two of our Big Five decoy makers lived here in Peoria. Charles Schoenheder, Sr., was a cabinet maker who supplemented his income with market hunting. Thus, he turned his woodworking skills to decoy carving, producing close to 3,000 decoys over 5 decades. Finally, there was Bert Graves, who, like Robert Elliston before him, was a professional decoy maker. In fact, he knew the Ellistons, and Catherine Elliston even painted some of his decoys. These 5 names, Elliston, Purdue, Walker, Schoenheder, and Graves, form the core of Lakeview's decoy collection.
In addition to the Big Five, as we call them, Graves, Elliston, Schoenheder, Walker, and Purdue, there are many other fine carvers that worked in the Illinois River Valley, all the way from Beardstown at the south to Joliet and into the Chicago area. Names such as Hiram Holtz from Peoria, Michael Valero and Cameron and Wilcoxon and Kessler, and dozens more turned out decoys not only for their own use but for sale to friends and other hunters. It's been Lakeview's objective to collect decoys from all of the major carvers in the Illinois River Valley, and we have maintained a nice collection, and we hope to promote the awareness that this form of folk art, which wasn't done for art but for utilitarian purposes, is worthy of our collections and worthy of the preservation that we are attempting to achieve.